Welcome back to my video series where I take you through every single part of Betaflight 4.3 configurator from start to finish, top to bottom. So any option you see here in the configurator, you'll know what it does. Today we are continuing our walk through the PID tuning tab. We're going to be looking at the filters tab. And if that's what you're here for, great. But if you stumbled across this video somehow and you didn't realize it was part of a complete Betaflight tutorial, probably more information than anybody needs, but if you're a glutton for punishment like that, there is a link down in the video description to the playlist with all of these videos in it so you don't miss a single thing. On to the filters tab. And I got to admit that this is going to be one of the hardest tabs in all of Betaflight configurator for me to kind of do my job on, because even if you're an expert at Betaflight PID tuning, a lot of the stuff that you see here, you're kind of not actually supposed to manipulate directly. So for example, we've got the Gyro Lowpass dynamic filter with a cutoff frequency of 200 or 500. And is that right for you? I don't know. And neither do a lot of people who are experts at PID tuning. And that's why the Betaflight developers gave us these sliders. So I want to start this walk through this tab by looking at these sliders, the gyro filter multiplier and the Dterm filter multiplier. And I want to tell you the most basic thing you can do to tune your filters is you can move these sliders to the left or to the right. To the left means worse flying quadcopter, but more filtering, so more protection from bad things happening. And to the right means better flying quadcopter, but more risk of bad things happening. So although this isn't a PID tuning guide, I have those videos, but we're just talking about what do these controls do. The general goal when tuning filters is to have the least amount of filtering you can get away with without bad things happening. And so we would want to push these sliders as far to the right as we could, doing a test flight in between each iteration and seeing if there were signs of any bad things happening. And when we got these as far to the right as we could get them, then we could proceed with the rest of the PID tune. But this isn't a PID tuning guide, so we're not going to talk more about that. Now, in order to really understand what the filter tab is doing, we have to understand what a low pass and a notch filter is. And I am going to use a low pass and a notch filter to manipulate the sound of my voice as I'm talking. And what you're hearing happen with your ears is exactly the same thing that these filters are doing, but they're not doing it to audio noise. They're doing it to a different kind of noise. We'll talk about that in just a second. So a low pass filter, a simple way to explain it is that it rolls off the treble so that you get rid of the high frequencies in the noise. And as I decrease the cutoff frequency, you can see that we lose more and more of the high frequencies, moving down to the mid frequencies and even lower. A notch filter, on the other hand, cuts a notch of frequencies out, and that can target a very specific frequency of noise. I can change the width of the notch, and I can move the notch up and down in frequency to depend on which specific frequency of noise I'm trying to get rid of. Now here's why Betaflight and all flight controllers need filtering on their gyro data. Because the motors on the quadcopter rotate and make vibration, and they make a substantial amount of vibration. Motors on a quadcopter might be spinning at between 10,000 and 30,000 RPM for a typical mini quad, and that makes a lot of vibration, and that confuses the gyro. The gyro is trying to detect that vibration, and it's also trying to detect the actual movements of the quad. So the quad is flying and moving, and the gyros and the PID controller are trying to make it fly good. And then while all that's happening, the motors are going, except it's like, 200 hertz or 400 hertz instead of like my voice, which is nowhere near that. So the goal of the filters is to get rid of the motor vibrations, the motor noise, and let the quadcopter, let the flight controller focus on the actual movements of the quadcopter. And we use low pass filters and we use notch filters for that. We use low pass filters because the movements of the quadcopter are very slow. You might think they're pretty fast. We're going to do a 1300 degree per second spin, a snap roll. They're really not that fast. Most of the time, they're between 20 hertz and maybe as much as 30 or maybe 50 hertz, but probably not even 50 hertz. So why don't we just do a filter at 50 hertz, and then that's just the, we just chop off and get rid of all that extra data. The problem is that filtering also causes phase delay in the data, and this is a deeper topic than we really are going to go into because this isn't a full PID tuning filtering guide. But the bottom line is that too much filtering makes the quad fly badder, and less filtering makes the quad fly gooder. So why don't we just get rid of all the filtering? Because when there's not enough filtering, the quad also flies badder. So we want the least amount of filtering we can get away with. It's like the Goldilocks. Not too little, not too much, just enough. So we're going to start up here with these sliders, the gyro filter multiplier and the Dterm filter multiplier. And what I want you to know about filter tuning is tuning filters is fairly complicated and requires a lot of looking at black box logs and reading the frequencies that the vibrations are at and so forth. And most people, even people who want to do PID tuning, just don't put that much effort into it. And that's why the Betaflight devs have given us these sliders. Because what these sliders do, if you look over here at the gyro low pass, as I move this slider to the right and the left, you'll see that these numbers are changing. What do they mean? You don't have to think about it very much. The devs have tuned these numbers as we move this slider to the left and to the right to be reasonable and to just say, look, I want a little more filtering or a little less filtering, and you don't have to worry about the actual numbers. You can just turn the knob, if you will. But of course, we're going to talk about these filters, even though probably most of the time you won't be setting these values manually. And the first one we're going to see is the Gyro Lowpass Filter. So this is a low-pass filter on the gyro data. And the idea is that those motor frequencies are up around 250, 300, maybe 400 hertz, maybe higher. And so if we just do we roll off that treble, so we only get the lower frequencies, then we can get rid of that noise that we don't need to see. Betaflight 4.3 by default has 2 low-pass filters. So you sort of stack them one on top of the other, and you get a little bit more filtering than if you only had a single filter. The second one is static, which means that it is always at the same frequency. And the first one can be set to dynamic mode, which means that its low pass frequency goes up and down as the throttle position and the motor RPM change. If you think about it, when the motors are screaming at full throttle, they're spinning at 25,000 RPM. The frequency of that noise is a very high frequency, and so you don't need as aggressive filtering. It's only when you bring the throttle down and the motors slow down that you then end up with lower frequency noise that causes more problems. So that's what the dynamic low-pass filter does. It moves up and down as the throttle and the motor frequency, the motor RPM changes. Now you see here we do have a min cutoff and a max cutoff frequency, which constrain the dynamic low-pass filter. At its highest, it'll be at 500 hertz. At its lowest, it'll be at 250 hertz. And once again, you don't really want to think about those numbers directly. You can just move this slider to the right and the left to get more or less filtering as you go through the PID tuning process. Now you could, if you wanted, change the mode from dynamic to static and put in a single static cutoff frequency that would just stay the same at all times. Why would you want to do that? Why wouldn't you want the dynamic one? Well, that's the kind of question that you would answer through a lot of black box log analysis and testing and tuning, and most people should probably just leave it on dynamic, and I think we've fulfilled our mission for this video by just telling you that the option to change it from dynamic to static is there. And it's a long bunny trail to tell you why you would do that we're not going to go down. The remaining filters on the gyro are all notch filters. And that means they're going to target a specific frequency band. The idea is that the motors are going to make a big peak of noise at a specific frequency, and we want to maybe notch that out. Or a frame might have resonance at a specific frequency, and again, a notch filter would be perfect for getting rid of that. Anytime you've got a big spike of noise, a notch filter is the right thing to filter that out. Now you may not see the RPM filter here. You're going to need to be in the Motors tab, and you're going to need to have bidirectional D-shot enabled. And in order for this to really work, you're going to need to have an ESC that supports bidirectional D-shot. Because what the RPM filter does is use bidirectional D-shot to read the RPM of the motor directly from the ESC. And then when it knows the RPM of the motor, it knows what frequency the noise of the motor is going to be. You just calculate that directly from the RPM, and then it creates a notch filter that directly targets that frequency. So you basically always want the Gyro RPM filter enabled if your ESC can possibly support bidirectional D-shot. It is basically just good. And in fact, if you can enable the Gyro RPM filter, if that's working, you can almost always disable this low pass filter here, because this does such great job at filtering out the motor noise, you actually don't even usually need the second low pass. But this is not a PID tuning guide. That sounds like PID tuning advice. We're not going down that bunny trail. The two parameters for the Gyro RPM filter are the harmonics number. So every frequency will have overtones or harmonics, and that's true of the motor frequency as well. So if you have a motor that's spinning at 300 hertz, then there will be harmonics going up at double, 2x, and 3x I don't actually know, 2x and 3x, I think, the frequency. And the Gyro RPM filter can filter those harmonics out as well. You could theoretically turn this down, and it would reduce the amount of filtering, which would make your quad theoretically fly better, but provide less filtering. Most people seem to agree that 3 is the right number here. Going higher than that, you actually can't go higher than that. Isn't that interesting? There's not enough energy in the harmonics. They get weaker as you go up. So there's not enough energy there for them to really need to be filtered. And you can turn it down, but you will oftentimes see negative effects from turning it down, like a little bit of extra jello or mid-throttle oscillation or other types of problems. So most people would recommend that you leave it at 3. The Gyro RPM filter min frequency is the lowest that the filter will go. Notch filters can add a lot of latency, especially if they are very wide. And we don't have any control over the width of the RPM filter, that's locked. But also the lower the frequency of the notch filter, the more latency it causes and the worse the quad flies. So we set a limit here on how low it can go. Bear in mind that when the motors come down to a very low frequency, these low-pass filters are actually going to do the heavy lifting of filtering that noise out. So to some degree, we don't need the notch filter to target the motors once they go very low, and that's some of the thought here. Now, the dynamic notch filter is similar to the RPM filter, but in that it is a moving notch filter that tracks peaks in the gyro noise spectrum. But the way the dynamic notch filter decides where to be is different than the Gyro RPM filter. The RPM filter reads the motor RPM directly from the ESC and tracks those and filters out those frequencies. The dynamic notch filter looks at the gyro noise and looks for peaks and then cuts out those peaks. It just looks for the worst peak, the tallest peak, and slices it off. So for example, before we had the RPM filter, the dynamic notch filter tried to do that same job. It just looked for the motor peaks and tried to filter them out. But the problem is that the dynamic notch filter can never be as fast and precise as the gyro filter. The gyro filter knows the exact frequency that the motors are spinning at. The dynamic notch filter has to look and say, oh, there's the motor, I'm going to go get it. And it's always sort of chasing just a little bit behind the actual motor frequencies. So then why do we even have the dynamic notch filter? Didn't the RPM filter just completely replace it? Sort of. Once the RPM filter came into existence, the dynamic notch filter could be moved, could be repurposed to a different job. For example, most frames will have resonance peaks or harmonic resonance, where at a certain frequency, there will just always be this big spike of vibrational noise. Regardless of the motor RPM, there'll just always be this spike there. And maybe it moves a little bit depending on the motor RPM, but it mostly just stays in one place. The dynamic notch filter is very, very good at tracking that sort of thing. Now the notch filter parameters include the min frequency and the max frequency, which is the range within which the dynamic notch will look for noise peaks. And again, if you're not looking at black box logs and seeing where your gyro noise is, you're going to find it very difficult to tune this. That's why the devs have done what they've done. In general, the max value of 600 will seldom need to be changed, because even for very small quadcopters with very high RPM motors, you're probably not going to go above 600 hertz. The min value is sometimes changed. If you have a 7-inch, an 8-inch, a 9-inch, 10, maybe a 13-inch quadcopter with very low RPM motors and big props, you might lower the min frequency because the motors are going to be just spinning so much slower that this range of frequencies that the dynamic filter needs to look at might be a little wider. So in theory, we might lower this down to maybe 90 hertz or maybe a little lower than that, but not much lower than about, say, 70 to 90 hertz. The Q factor is the width of the notch. The wider a notch is, the more noise it filters out, but the less precise it is and the more delay it has. So the higher this number, the narrower the notch. The lower this number, the wider the notch. Again, if you don't know how to read black box and mess with and look at gyro data, then probably you should just leave this at the default of 500. And then the notch count determines how many notches there are. The more notches there are, the more individual noise peaks can be targeted, but also the more delay there is. The default is to have only one notch, with the idea that it'll get rid of the worst noise peak and then sort of leave everything else for whatever's left. But in theory, you could add more if you had a situation where you had more than one notch on your particular quadcopter. Now we've also got these two notch filters here, Gyro Notch 1 and Gyro Notch 2, and these are static notch filters. They don't move. You tell them what frequency you want them to target, and then you tell them the cutoff frequency, and basically that is how wide you want the notch to be. So if I had a center frequency of 400 and a cutoff frequency of 350, the notch would go from 350, it would be at its strongest at 400, and then it would go up to 450, and that's the width. Really, the only reason you would use a static notch would be if you knew that you had a specific noise peak at a specific frequency that didn't move. Like even when you change throttle position and motor RPM, it just stayed in the same place. In that case, there's no sense having the dynamic notch like hunt for it. You know where it is and you can just slice it out. This is an extremely rare circumstance, and for almost all situations, you're just not going to use these. So those are the filters on the gyro data. The gyro data comes in, it goes through the filters, it goes into the PID controller. The PID controller does stuff and calculates a P, an I, a D, and a feed-forward term. And we talked a little bit about those in the previous video in this playlist about the PID controller, although, again, this is not a video about like PID control and how PID controllers work. It's a video about the Betaflight configurator. It turns out that the D term, the way the D term is calculated, amplifies noise. So a little bit of noise comes out of the gyro, it goes into the D term calculation, and the D term itself it can be super noisy. And if a little bit of noise gets through the gyro filters, then the D term can be super noisy, and you could get problems like hot motors or flyaways. So the D term actually needs additional filtering just for itself. And the D term filtering looks very similar to what we saw over here with the gyro. We've got a dynamic low pass, we've got a second static low pass, and then we've got a notch filter, a static notch filter that we could enable if we felt we needed to target a specific band of frequencies. That's analogous to this gyro notch filter. And you might think, well, when do I tune the gyro filter low pass versus the D term filter low pass? And the answer to that question is, for most people, I think the approach that I would take is to move these two sliders together. Some PID tuning and filtering experts could probably come up with situations where you would want like less gyro filtering but more D term filtering, and it's just not a place we're going to go in this video, which is focusing just sort of on what are these controls and what do they do. We're running into a really weird situation here where it's hard to talk about what these controls do without going off into a 5-hour treatise on PID tuning, and I'm just trying to carefully walk that line for you. So just move these sliders together. The D-term and the gyro filtering moves together. Generally, don't even worry about manually setting these values, and refer to a PID tuning guide for more information about exactly how to tune these. There's a couple more settings I haven't touched on yet. One of them is the filter type. The filter type is all over here. We've got it on gyro and we've got it on D-term. There are different types of low-pass filters, PT1, PT2, and PT3. And I believe those are simply, a PT1 is a particular mathematical algorithm that sort of cuts off the high frequencies in a certain way. A PT2, I'm pretty sure, is just 2 PT1 filters stacked in a row, and a PT3 is 3 of them stacked in a row. I guess I shouldn't say pretty sure, because I'm not actually that sure, because this really isn't my area of expertise. A BIQUAD is a different shape of curve. It's a steeper curve, so a BIQUAD can give more filtering close to at a higher, you can have a higher cutoff frequency, but then a steeper curve, so you get better filtering above it. But it has some other effects that some devs feel are negative. That's why PT1 is the default, and this is the kind of thing that people do a lot of testing and a lot of work to figure out the best one, and I'm just not even going to try and make recommendations. It's just not something I just trust the devs on this one. But for example, if we look at the tooltip here, they mention that some people use a single dynamic BIQUAD, and because the BIQUAD filter has more aggressive filtering than the default PT1, they can disable this second PT1 filter. Which is better? I don't know. Just stick to what the devs give me in this case. Next, we've got the Yaw Lowpass Filter, which is an additional low-pass filter on gyro data. So really, in some sense, this Yaw Lowpass should be over here on the left, because we've kind of got gyro on the left and D-term on the right. But, oh, I see. It's actually profile independent versus profile dependent. Got it. We'll talk about that in a second. That's why Yaw Lowpass is on the right. This is a gyro filter. It's a gyro low-pass filter on the yaw axis. And there is sometimes a benefit to having additional filtering just on the yaw axis. The main reason is that the yaw axis usually has extremely weak authority compared to the pitch and roll axis, because it uses motor torque to generate thrust instead of actually just pushing with a prop. And so you can keep the yaw axis from getting sort of overactive or overreactive by adding additional low pass to it. This is on by default, and most people are going to leave it on. Yeah, that brings us then to the profile independent versus the profile dependent filter settings. When I set it to off, it disables the multiplier slider and lets me manually put these values in. When I set it to on, I can't change the values manually, and I can only use the sliders. And then there are the profile dependent filter settings. I do know what that means. These profile independent settings are not stored in the PID profile. When you change the PID profile, they will not change. They are universal across the whole quadcopter. The profile dependent filter settings are stored in the PID profile. And so, for example, if we disable D-term low pass 1 and hit save, that was profile 2, but if we change back to profile 1, it's re-enabled. However, the gyro low pass, the stuff on the left, stays the same regardless of which profile we are in. But what is this on versus off? If I set that to off, then what happens? The sliders. We're just turning the sliders on and off. It's got nothing to do with, I was like, does it change whether they're profile dependent? No, it's just turning the sliders on and off. When I set this to on, the sliders are on. When I set this to off, the sliders are off, and we can manually set the values. Oh, okay, I figured it out. Give me long enough, I'll get around to it. So that is the filters tab, and I have never felt so much desire to go into a long treatise about how to tune this stuff. I hate giving you information without practical application, but we just can't do that in this video. Instead, I'm going to link you down in the video description to Chris Rosser's filter tuning video. Normally, I link to my own videos, but he did such a gosh darn good job explaining how to tune this stuff and how to set this stuff up that I just linked to his video. In fact, I'll put a card on screen linking to his video, as well as a card on screen linking to this playlist if you're ready to go on to the next video in this playlist, which will be servos, because that's about the only thing left. And I have no experience with servos. Okay, I have a tiny bit. And Betaflight's really bad at servos. So here are those cards I promised you. And I'll see you there. Sure glad I'm almost done with this series. Because we're really coming down to the stuff I like the least. Because it makes me look dumb. And I hate looking dumb.